Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the program on extremism. My name is John Lewis. I'm a research fellow with the program, and we're very excited to have you here today for what are sure is a very interesting conversation. I'm pleased to be joined by Louis Keene, who is a reporter for The Forward. Um, Louis recently had the distinct pleasure of covering the Sam Woodward trial, an Adam Waffen member who was charged in the murder of a gay Jewish student in California in 2018 by the name of Blaise Bernstein. We're very excited to have Louis here today to share his firsthand perspectives of covering the trial and discuss a bit about the broader context and what we can learn from Adam Waffen and this broader neo-Nazi movement from the trial. So, Louis, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, I'd love just to start off. It would be great to just hear from you. You know how you end up covering this trial, how you find yourself covering this event out in California.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a reporter for The Forward, which is a Jewish newspaper. It's actually the country's oldest and largest Jewish newspaper. And I've been covering Jewish LGBT issues a lot ever since I started working there, more related to LGBT issues, especially in the observant Jewish space and how sort of LGBT Orthodox and conservative Jews are sort of fighting for their ability to be recognized as couples, whether it's being married, whether it's being welcomed into their religious spaces. Um, and so I've sort of always been covering LGBT Jewish issues. And Blaise Bernstein's murder, which occurred back in 2018, before I started working at The Forward, had never gone on trial. And so at the 5-year mark, we decided to do a story on how come it hadn't gone to trial. And through that, I sort of developed a relationship with Blaise's mother, Jeannie Pepper, and continued following the case. And when it went to trial, well, before it went to trial, there were a number of evidence hearings down in Orange County. I went to one. They revealed sort of some of the defendant's diary entries against gay people, and they were just really sort of intense and revealing. And I thought that there was definitely going to be a bigger story here over the course of the trial. The defense attorney seemed really bullish on his ability to defend his client and said, he had this plan. And so I sort of pitched it to my editors and they decided to run with it. And so I was able to cover a lot of the trial and did a number of stories on it and was able to see it through to the verdict.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as you begin to cover the trial, I think it's pretty clear from the opening statements. Obviously, there's two very differing perspectives on how each side sees this case going. I think as you laid out there a bit, the prosecution's case is I think fairly straightforward, right? It's that Woodward, the defendant here, they accuse him of being reactionary kind of far right extremist who has joined this neo-Nazi group and who is perpetrating this act in furtherance of these homophobic and anti-Semitic ideas. Can you talk a bit about how the opening statements of the case unfolded and how that kind of set the stage for the rest of this very long trial?
Yeah, it was really interesting because both the defense and the prosecution sort of worked off the same material. Um, they were looking at the same sequence of events dating back to Woodward's, early adolescence or even his childhood, and just reading it differently. So the prosecution said Woodward had been trained to be homophobic since he was a kid. He grew up in a home where his parents um, believed homosexuality was a sin and sort of raised him to be an Eagle Scout who knew how to work with knives and sort of how to dig holes. And once he got to college, after he dropped out of college, he joined this neo-Nazi group, and the neo-Nazi group sort of fortified or accelerated his homophobic views that his parents had inculcated him within him from a young age, and he sort of developed into this cold-blooded killer who was just waiting for the right target and chose this gay Jewish boy that he went to high school with as the perfect target because he was easy. He could lure him to park on pretenses of a hookup. And we had these diary entries that Woodward had emailed to himself saying how much he hates gay people. And all this sort of presents an open and shut case for a first-degree murder with a hate crime enhancement. And the defense looked at that same information and said, this is someone who wasn't sure about his own sexual orientation. His parents um, uh, made that even worse by telling him it was a sin and that his life would be harder if he was gay. And so he had sort of internalized all this doubt and self-hatred. Um, and he didn't actually hate Blaise Bernstein because he didn't hate gay people at all. He thought that he might be one, and he had sent um, pictures of himself to other boys, and had always sort of seemed to be exploring whether he might be gay too. And so when they met up that night, the defense did admit that in the opening statements that Woodward had killed the victim, Blaise Bernstein, but they said that he wasn't luring him to a park on pretenses of a hookup. Like he had gone there potentially to hook up or because he thought Blaise was cool and wanted to meet him as a friend. And that something actually happened that night that due to all this internalized fear and suspicion around sexual orientation, that Blaise had done something to provoke him and that motivated a second degree or murder or potentially as they wound up asking for a manslaughter charge. Um, and that set the tone for 3 months of testimony from boys that Woodward had gone to elementary school with or had carpooled with, his previous employers, um, folks who testified that he had been autistic, but that his parents hadn't gotten diagnosed until months before the killing occurred, and and actually both parents of both the victim and the defendant testified during the trial.
Mhm. And I think that's, one of the elements of this that's, fascinating from the jump, right? Is that both sides are pretty much in agreement that this series of events took place, that there was this attack by Woodward on Bernstein. But obviously I think they, yeah, as you said, come to quite different conclusions of how exactly this took place and the premeditated nature of it. And so I guess as the prosecution starts its case, I believe early on his testimony from Bernstein's parents. Um, what would that have looked like for you? What was that experience like seeing both of them testify in this case?
Yeah, it was really interesting and really emotional to see the parents take the stand. I know for them, they had waited for 6 years by the time they took the stand. Um, and they were ready, I would say. Jeannie Pepper, who's, as I said, Blaise's mother, she was a very, I don't say very combative, but she sort of pushed back against a lot of the things that the defense attorney wanted to ask about. She was not cooperative with him, as you might expect. Um, but I think both parents went up there basically to describe what those first few hours were like after they realized he went missing. And it was really sort of heart-wrenching to hear about, you know, their own panic. You know, these are parents who already had, they were extremely protective of their son. They mentioned that they had this app that Blaise had on his phone called like Life 360, where they were supposed to know where he was at all times. But Blaise, like a typical teenager, didn't want that on his phone. He didn't want his parents to know where he was all the time, and he had just deleted it. Um, but he was using a laptop that the mom had given him, and so they were able to log in to his computer to find his social media interactions, and that's how they found out that he had matched um with this boy he had gone to high school with on Tinder, and that which was Sam Woodward, and they immediately contacted him, and on the first or second day of testimony, we heard the phone call between Woodward the day after he had killed their son and the Bernstein parents and what that was like. As he said, "Oh, I want to find Blaze as much as you guys do." And I drove him to this park, and he said he was going to go meet up with a third friend. And he walked away and never came back. And I was really mad at him. And so I eventually drove home. And these were just lies and lies and lies. And the parents knew something was up. And they called the police after that. And that's when they filed the missing persons report. Um, but sort of it was gutting to hear that in the trial.
And so I guess here is, where we get to where the prosecution lays out their version of events, which I think largely ends up being the version of events that the jury decides to listen to. And so they lay out, again, from your reporting from inside the trial, they lay out, I think, the series of events that actually leads to the attack, right? You have I believe Bernstein inviting Woodward over to his house. I believe Woodward has an Atomwaffen mask and the folding knife in his car. Could you just walk through what the actual series of events that was laid out there in terms of Woodward going to Bernstein's house, then going to the park, and then the ultimate aftermath of that?
Sure. So, I'll step back a little bit to give more context. 'Cause I don't know how much your readers know or your listeners know coming into this story. So these two boys had gone to high school together. Um, this was years after that. So Blaze was a student at University of Pennsylvania, returning home for winter break. This was January of 2018, and they match on Tinder. And this is the second time that they've matched. They matched 6 months prior, but they never actually met up. And Sam Woodward said at the end, he said, "Oh, I'm not really interested in boys. I just wanted to hear sort of what it's like to be complimented by another boy and how gay people talk to each other, sort of a morbid curiosity thing." And Blaze was very sort of, he kind of saw through that on some level, but just kind of ignored it. So they match again, January 2nd, 2018. And this time, Sam says, Blaze, I'd make an exception for you. And Blaze says, "Well, we've already been through that." And we looked at this transcript in court, and Sam says, "No, look, what's your Snapchat?" They exchange Snapchat. They move the conversation over there. Blaze then sends his home address to Sam. Sam immediately gets in the car and drives over. This is around 10:30, 11 p.m. on January 2nd, and picks up Blaze near Blaze's house or outside Blaze's house. They drive to a park within a couple blocks from Blaze's house in Orange County. They go to the park. Video footage shows that the two of them park in the park parking lot. The two of them walk into the park. They turn around after maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes. They walk back. They get in the car. The car drives off. And that's all we have video footage wise. They later circle back, and this is the prosecution's narrative. They circle back to the park where Sam basically draws Blaze into this wooded area behind the park, sort of in a corner behind the basketball courts. And again, this is the prosecution's narrative. We don't have strong evidence for this, but basically, sort of suggests that Blaze takes off his shirt, and Blaze takes off his shirt, and as he's taking it off, that's when Sam takes out his knife and start stabbing him to death. And the evidence for the shirt thing, which seems a little bit could seem esoteric, is there were 4 stab wounds inside of the shirt that did not align with where Blaze was stabbed on his body. So he was stabbed 28 times, around 20 times just in the neck area, a couple of defensive wounds, but the stab wounds and the stab holes in the shirt didn't line up with where he was stabbed on the body. So in closing arguments, Jennifer Walker, who was the DA, um, said basically that that's what must have happened. He said, we're going to go to the secluded area where we can have more privacy. Blaze takes off his shirt, and he uses that opportunity to stab him. As you mentioned, there's a Adam Waffen mask, which is sort of this sort of skull. It's sort of a skull face with the sort of eye holes, and there were sort of blood splashes on it, which gave the impression that he was wearing it at the time or holding it at the time when he stabbed Blaze to death. But that was just sort of the prosecution's argument,
Yeah,
which the jury took.
sure. And so, I think most, if not all, of that evidence is admissible, right? It's entered in the shirt, the messages. I think obviously there was some back and forth about how much of the Snapchat record was preserved versus what was still out there, but largely, I think there was a fairly comprehensive picture of how each of them got to the park that night. I think that's, it was largely agreed upon by both sides. But obviously, as you alluded to here, once Blaze's parents testify, and after they're wrapped up, you ultimately have the defense argument, and a lot of that is coming from testimony from his parents, friends, and family. But I guess, yeah, to start, could you just walk through the defense argument here, right? How are they describing this series of events? You spoke a bit about how his upbringing and his background come into play here. But yeah, how they are portraying this event here as kind of like this spur of the moment, almost self-defense action.
Right. So the setup, I'll just be quick. I'll summarize the setup quickly, is that he's extremely fragile. He's just an extremely fragile person. He's autistic, but not diagnosed. He never learned how to cope with his anger. His parents, you know, might might uh, might disown him if they ever heard that he was gay, etc. As far as that night, um, there was one major piece of sort of written evidence that they drew on, and that evidence was a pair of texts that Blaze sent within minutes of when he was killed. And those texts were to his best friend saying, "I just did something really horrible for the story, but no one can ever know." And so we don't know what that was. Um, but my understanding is that's a piece of evidence that wouldn't typically be allowed in court, for being hearsay, basically. But the judge allowed it into trial on the condition, again, this is just my understanding, on the condition that Sam testify.
Mhm.
So that was the only way that they could include that potentially exculpatory evidence. Because the defense could say, if he did something really horrible, what could that horrible thing have been? It could have been anything, right? So the defense needed that, so they put Sam on the stand. Um, and Sam's story, so we're waiting basically the whole trial to hear what that story would have been. And Sam's story was that they went to the park that night. Um, Sam didn't say that they were going to hook up. He said they were going to sort of hang out and smoke pot. Sam said that he had pot that was labeled very potent or extremely potent, and he rolled a joint, which he had. He carried all of his cannabis paraphernalia in a sleeping bag, which sleeping bag was one of the pieces of evidence that had a lot of blood on it. Um, and he smokes some pot. Blaze, he couldn't recall whether Blaze partook, but he took a couple of puffs and then was immediately so inebriated that he kind of browned out. He sort of, I don't want to say lost consciousness, but was sort of out of it. And he comes to and he feels kind of warmth in his leg area, which he thinks maybe he's like urinated himself, because he said he's done that before when he's been really drunk. So he thought maybe that's what happened. But then he looked down and he saw actually his pants had been unbuckled, and Blaze's hand was in the innermost part of his thigh, and in Blaze's other hand was a phone with and he could see the light from his phone sort of reflecting at Blaze's face. And so he believed that Blaze might have been taking a photo of him. He quickly reacted. He said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" He says, Blaze said, "It's too late. I got you. I got you. You're a hypocrite." And and Sam then tried to take the phone from him, couldn't take the phone from him. And then he had this knife, which he had said earlier that he used the knife to open the container of marijuana, and then stabbed. And then he said the phone wasn't in the way anymore, and I just stabbed him, again and again and again.
I know a lot of your coverage, and I know a lot of the photos that had come out around the trial of Woodward were obviously pretty notable. And I guess speaking about his own testimony and how he portrayed the events, I think he obviously stood out in his testimony, and I think even just how he appeared in the courtroom. Could you just talk a bit about his testimony, if he came across as how he came across, I think is best, and if he seemed to be a reliable narrator of the events here.
Yeah, he waited, and he was an example. He was probably the best example of a theme throughout the trial, which was the defense not being able to help itself, or the defense witnesses not helping the defense. I mean, even if he had just looked and presented himself differently, um, the way he responded to questions might not have been so jarring. But yeah, he looked like Manson on the stand, which was of a piece with what we learned about Adam Waffen during the trial, which was that they kind of worship Manson. So he had long, sort of shoulder length hair. His facial hair was kind of overgrown. His hair frequently covered his face, and his attorney frequently asked him, can you push the hair out of your face, which he sometimes did. Um, he almost always answered after pausing for 10 or more seconds. Sometimes he paused for 20 or 30 seconds before answering a question. Um, he spoke in sort of this low monotone. And then occasionally he would ramble and he would just kind of talk and talk and talk. Um, but it was, you know, the defense was using that to sort of demonstrate his mental decline in the years since the event happened. But I'm not sure that the jury sort of regarded that either way. But it was difficult to listen to.
And it didn't really appear to be a significant defense, right? I think a lot of what they were building up with respect to how this as the defense presented it, this kind of spur of the moment reaction took place. But there didn't appear to be too much effort to really I know they talk about preserving the record for appeals or whatever, but there didn't really seem to be too much of a focus on whatever Woodward's current state of mind might be. But yeah, certainly to your point that I think from your reporting, it certainly didn't appear that he was the most forthcoming. But I think one person that did seem to appear to be at least somewhat forthcoming was Woodward's mother, right? And I think you wrote a bit about how her time on the stand, I mean, she couldn't remember a fair bit, it seemed like, from across her 4 days of testimony. But it also kind of struck me as, someone who's simultaneously, trying to protect their son and their family while also um, trying to be honest. I guess, what was your takeaway from I guess both of his parents and his family testifying?
Yeah, the Woodward parents' testimony was fascinating. I think sort of revealed this big question or theme at the heart of this trial about Orange County and appearances. And, they have these parents who have lost their son here. They're trying to create a possibility that he could ever sort of see the light of day again. But on the other hand, they're trying not to destroy the family that they have left. And shortly after Woodward's arrest in 2018, his father had given this interview to defense investigators where he kind of spilled everything and talked about how sort of antagonistic the family had been towards gays, um, and towards Sam in particular. He had been bullied at home by his older brother, who called him, you know, gay slurs and said he went to a gay high school. They were frequently getting in fights. Sam's father had become involved in some of those fights, separating them. But also it seemed like he had sometimes potentially hit his son, Sam. And, both parents took the stand and kind of walked back things that they had said earlier. And you mentioned Michelle Woodward, Sam's mother, said she couldn't recall a lot of the things that she had been very forthcoming about previously, um, which the defense sort of didn't know how to navigate that. It was just challenging for them. You could see in the room, he has these things he's basically reading off of a previous interview, and she's now saying she can't recall. And at one point, he sort of put her. He kind of, I don't want to say nailed her, but he kind of got her in this corner where he said, you know, he said, "Are you still?" He said, "Are you concerned?" This was related to the autism diagnosis. He said, "Were you concerned that the family wouldn't be perceived as normal?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Are you still concerned about how the family is perceived?" And she said, "Yes." "Are you concerned about how this trial will make Clay Woodward, your older son, look?" And she said, "Yes." When the prosecution um, cross-examined her, they said, "Would you have said these things if they weren't true?" And she said, "No." So, but it was still kind of this in a trial when the prosecution objected to any sort of leaps in process. So in a court, everything has to be established. You can't have any sort of hearsay. Um, Even something like Michelle, who, by the way, was an extremely devoted parent to her son, even if she, no parent is perfect, but this was someone who, before her son went off to college, she prepared a several-page document on how to navigate college, how to talk to girls, how to make friends. Basically an instruction manual because she knew her son sort of wasn't socially adept and would struggle. She drove from Orange County all the way to Calabasas, where the college was, to deliver his medication. So this is something that came up. So they said they objected to how did you know what medication it was? So they had to establish. So she looked at the medication to see what kind of medication it was. They were all sort of in a trial where that kind of stuff was being objected to on a very granular level. The family's non-cooperation with the defense attorney made sort of building this, picture uh, difficult. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but I think it came through, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely something that does show itself to be very evident from the reporting that you did about their testimony. I remember there was this section around she had written like this 6-page letter to him, right? Effectively saying like I'm, that she's scared of him, that she here's what to do when you get angry. Effectively, this kind of long letter all about her perception of the issues that he has. But yeah, again, I think it's just that fascinating dichotomy of trying to protect, her son and her family's reputation at the same time, which certainly, from the evidence appear to be pretty contradictory goals. I know one area before we get into the audience Q&A, and I would just encourage anyone who has questions to add it to the Q&A now, and we'll get to it at the second half of this. But you know, Woodward's relationship with Adamhoff and the individuals who did testify, I think it is something that is certainly a really fascinating perspective to all this. Could you speak a bit about the individuals that did testify, who they were? I believe one of them used their real identity, and kind of what that looked like.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there were a pair of Adam Waffen members who testified during the trial. Um, one for the prosecution and one for the defense.
Mhm.
And they presented completely different pictures on the stand of what this group was. So for people who are new to or haven't really heard about Adam Waffen before, Adam Waffen is this far right extremist group that was founded sort of in 2015, 2016, 2017 area. It was small, um, it was never more than 80 members at its peak. At the time Woodward joined the group, it was maybe 20 or 30 spread out across the country. And it was mainly a Discord group, which is this online chat forum. They had sort of their own channel where they would post memes and talk about getting together and make propaganda. And occasionally they would make runs to, as the first Adam Waffen member to testify shared, they would make trips down to college campuses, post these flyers that would say, be anti-gay or anti-Jewish propaganda. Um, and they would go to bars to try to pick fights. Um, and this first Adam Waffen member to testify is actually the person who told reporters and told the Bernstein parents that Woodward was a member of Adam Waffen. Adam Waffen had celebrated um, Woodward's arrest, not his arrest, but his connection to this murder, and he was kind of a hero in the group. And actually, even as I reported on this, I received someone messaged me and said, referred to his name and, kind of cheering him on. Um, but now the group is defunct. It's been sort of investigated by the FBI and sort of had to disband. Um, the other thing to mention is Adam Waffen used this book called Siege. It was written by this neo-Nazi named James Mason, based off of a number of blog posts or newsletters he had written. I guess they weren't blogs at the time, back in the 1980s. Turned into a book and sort of became this Bible. And Sam Woodward had actually written a uh, admissions test for new members based off of Siege, that they had to sort of understand the tenets of Siege, which is the name of this book, um, which described the value of lone wolf attacks, just like the one that Woodward arguably did. Um, and so going back to their testimony, so the first ex-member to testified under, his name was Brian Murphy, but basically believed to be a pseudonym. And he said these guys are the real deal. They're scary. And they talked about doing these, violent acts, and a few of them did. Um, he described encountering uh, Woodward and his friend Tristan Evans back when they lived in Texas together. The two had sort of tried to move out there to take construction jobs and totally burned out, and they couldn't get work, and they were on food stamps and eventually retreated. Woodward eventually came back to Orange County, and 6 months later committed his murder. The second uh, neo-Nazi to testify, that both of them were ex-members. So the first one said basically this stuff was once they both said that Woodward's uh, arrest sort of pushed them out of the group for good. That they were just like, no, I don't believe in this, and I don't want any part of this. The second one went up there with his full name. He said, I've been dating another man for the last 4 years. I'm like a centrist, liberal, sort of a Hillary Clinton Democrat, I think is what he said. And sort of kind of lived happily ever after. And he said, these guys, they doxed me. They put my name out on the internet and they've sent me a Quran with a nickname, address. That was kind of a gay slur. Um, but, I'm not really worried about them. And, these guys are just kind of edgelords that live in their parents' basements and aren't capable of really doing anything. And it was a completely different picture of what these guys were. And actually, so I spoke to Spencer Sunshine about this, who spoke in, I think, your panel a couple weeks ago. I said, so what is it? Is it one or is it the other? He said, it could be both. They could have, extremist rhetoric. Most of them could be just hang out in their basements, in their parents' basements, with no job and, no ability to actually do anything against anyone. But a couple of them, turn out to be wackos or loose cannons. I mean, it only takes one guy with a knife in this case, to do something, that can't be undone. And there were a number of violent incidents attributed to Atomwaffen members. There were arrests, of one trying to take down, I think, the Idaho power grid. So, you know, some guys with wild ideas and some guys with wild plans to execute them, is enough, But Atomwaffen, I will say, it was framed during this trial as the most extreme of the various sort of neo-Nazi far-right groups that emerged sort of in the early Trump era. One of the things they mentioned was Woodward had been in he had joined this forum called Iron March, where he met other folks from a group called American Vanguard, which later changed its name to Vanguard America. American Vanguard is also the name of like my 401k, incidentally. But so and they left. Woodward and Evans, his friend, left American Vanguard because it wasn't extreme enough. They like, we want more action. Like, let's go to Atomwaffen. It's smaller, but it's more, intense, more hardline, and you know, one of the pieces of evidence that the prosecution called on towards the very end, and especially in his closing arguments, was Woodward had written on this piece of paper, he'd drawn a skull and he'd drawn a knife and he wrote, "Text is boring, murder isn't." And within 2 weeks, Blaze Bernstein was dead.
Yeah.
The defense looked at it and said, that literally doesn't mean anything. You could write anything on a piece of paper, but the jury did not deliberate for very long.
Yeah.
They went to deliberations like on a Tuesday and delivered the verdict on a Wednesday.
Hmm.
It was pretty quick.
Yeah, and I think, to the point of this doesn't mean anything. In your point that a lot of what the far right rhetoric today that we see, so much of it is kind of framed as just shit posting, right? Just like a wink and nod, just in group, out group rhetoric that makes sense to this group of neo-Nazis on Discord, but doesn't reflect
Trolling is a
trolling,
big
right?
part of it.
Exactly. And yeah, I think that's something that's really interesting from the reporting here is and it'd be great to do, the last question before we get into the audience Q&A of, how Woodward presented his affiliation here with Atomwaffen, and whether he at the end of all this, whether he showed remorse, right? How he kind of closed this kind of chapter of the trial here.
Yeah, I would say absolutely not on the remorse level. I think the closest thing they got to that was the defense attorney asking him, did Blaze Bernstein deserve to die? And he said no.
Hmm.
Um, but we also saw video from prison or from jail where Woodward has been held for the last 6 years, um, from his cellmate who was who got in trouble for basically beating up Woodward.
Hmm.
And they said, "Well, what's the story? Like, why did you beat him up?" And he's like, in the middle of the night, he started like chanting satanic incantations on the toilet. And I was like, be quiet or like go do that in your own area. And he's been doing this like nonstop. And I was finally like, I've had enough.
Mhm.
So like there was certainly evidence that he had not reformed, I would
Yeah.
say. Um, and in terms of his involvement with Atomwaffen, um, he said, he joined the group because he was looking for friendship and, it was a way to be a part of something. I think he compared it to like going fishing. Yeah, I have the quote written down here somewhere. Um, but yeah, that is basically it was a way to do male bonding
Yeah.
and that he didn't really put so much thought into what the group was thinking, but he didn't have that many friends, and here was a way to befriend some people and be a part of something, be a part of something that mattered. We knew he was into World War II history, Axis history since fifth or sixth grade. These guys are neo-Nazis. It's not a hard leap to make.
Yeah.
But he downplayed anything related to their rhetoric. He said he didn't remember a lot of Siege. They asked him, "Is this written in Siege?" He said, "It sounds like it could have been something in the book, but I didn't read the whole thing." So
Yeah.
it's like a 500-page book. So
Yeah, it's definitely not worth reading. And not very well written either. Yeah, no, but I think that certainly aligns and certainly tracks with the broader trends both in this case and other cases we see of Atomwaffen members of other neo-Nazis where yeah, again it's always distancing, it's always dismissing, it's always the wink and nod trolling. One question that's coming from the audience I think is really interesting to speak about for a bit here. Obviously, the murder of Blaise Bernstein is, the murder of a gay Jewish individual, right? Um, Obviously, a lot of this trial, given the evidence and given the circumstances, were related to the sexual orientation here of each of them. Um, but it would be, I'd be really curious to hear a bit about how the anti-Semitism did or didn't play a role in this.
yeah. So the important thing to start off with is that he was charged with a hate crime specifically for sexual orientation related hate crime, so not anti-Semitic. And the defense attorney or the prosecutor basically said, that's where the evidence was. So that's where we hewed to that. Um, Having said that, there were moments where the anti-Semitism sort of came into the open, especially towards the end. I'll say sort of in the beginning and in the end. Um, in the beginning, uh, when they interviewed the Woodwards on the stand, they talked a lot about what Blaise's Jewishness and Jewish identity meant and how that figured into their family. So um, the family observed Jewish holidays. They talked about Blaise having a bar mitzvah. He was a madrich, which is like a counselor in the Jewish day school, which he had also attended. Um, so both parents sort of took turns talking about the family's Jewishness. Um, the defense attorney, when it was his turn to cross-examine, uh, sort of tried to undercut that by asking, well, you know, did Blaise Bernstein wear a yarmulke? You know, and the parents said, or his father said on the stand, he said his last name was Bernstein. So everyone knew he was Jewish, even if he didn't walk around talking about how he was Jewish all the time. Um, and towards the end of the trial, we heard um, from Woodward's sort of psychologist. This was someone who had done a psychological examination of him after his arrest, but had done it several times in the past few years. And one of the things that the parents had told her was that he was kind of spouting off at home about how, Jewish people are ruining America and they're sort of advancing the gay agenda.
Hmm.
He had kind of anti-Semitic uh, rhetoric in his arsenal. But it just wasn't central to the development of either the victim or the perpetrator's character over the course of
Yeah.
the trial. Really, it was really, we knew he was this right winger in high school. He joined this neo-Nazi group. The neo-Nazi group did mostly anti-gay propaganda. Whether the Atomwaffen also really talked about anti-Semitic stuff as often as they talked about anti-LGBT stuff just wasn't something that the trial went into. I can say because I went to some of the evidence hearings that Woodward had also written stuff about Black people,
Yeah.
but the judge ruled it out of evidence because it wasn't pertinent to the specific questions around Blaise Bernstein's attack.
Right.
You could not have. There was no way that you could argue that Blaise Bernstein was killed because he was Black. So that it wasn't allowed into evidence. But we know that that stuff was also there.
Yeah, I think, and that's, I mean, certainly a really, really notable limitation. I think when we talk about, prosecuting domestic terrorism and far right extremists, especially in the U.S., right, when we don't have a specific federal statute, if there's a neo-Nazi who is arrested for gun charges, it's not super relevant if, he has siege on his bookshelf and, a wall full of swastikas. It's just the question of, was he a felon who had a firearm? Pretty open and shut. Um, Another, I think, really interesting question here, very in the weeds, as promised, but it was reported, I think, from your reporting that Woodward had told police that he had gotten all these visible scratches on his body from Fight Club. I think my recollection was that was mostly just his attempt to cover for whatever took place there. But was there any more exploration of what that perceived potential Fight Club may have been, or was that a figment of his uh, attempt to kind of get away with this?
Yeah, and he had presented. I can't recall too much of the Fight Club being explored. It's possible that happened on a day I wasn't there. But I would just say he gave a bunch of different excuses at different moments. He told, and some of that stuff also wasn't admitted.
Yeah.
So he had given um, a few interviews, long interviews before he was charged, before he was arrested and charged. So there's more context, but basically Bernstein was Woodward buried Bernstein himself that night in a park, and the body wasn't discovered for a week, which is crazy because they had investigators there looking every day. Actually, I think the chief of police there, I think, lost his job because it was embarrassing that they hadn't found him until an enormous amount of rain basically uncovered the body. Um, but after that, they saw him at the park with all this dirt under his nails. But in that week between when he was buried and when they found the body, uh, Woodward sat down and gave a number of police interviews. One of them was 2 or 3 hours long. They played the whole thing in trial,
Mhm.
but they didn't play all of them. Like one of them, he had said that Blaze had tried to kiss him, but that didn't come up at all. It wasn't in his final story. So he changed his stories a lot, and it's just something that we're not going to know what happened. We're not going to know what Blaze last two texts referred to,
Right.
but the jury can only work with what they've heard, what they've seen, and so you can't just use your imagination to believe something else happened based off the evidence provided. Everything that Sam said on the stand just didn't add up. Like it just didn't. There were holes in the story sort of on its face. Like the Fight Club thing would have been one of them.
Yeah.
And so that might have been a story one day. The next day he comes back and says, it was something else.
Yeah. No, and I think, again, that's a really tricky and challenging commonality we see again across so many of these when we're talking about far right extremists, right? Enrique Tarrio, Stuart Rhodes, these are not good actors, right? That they have no reason to give a fulsome, truthful description of their state of mind or their ideology or their worldview. Um, one thing it is interesting. I know the defense obviously was really leaning into a lot of conversations around Woodward's upbringing, his home life, his mental health. Um, I know the defense leaned into it a lot, but did the prosecution ever really, paint Woodward's actions as the consequence of his parents' failures to do anything about this in these kind of intervening years? I know there's a lot of focus from the defense on, what his state of mind may have been, what issues he was dealing with, but what was the prosecution leaning into that, or were they mostly just focused on the kind of straight and narrow here?
Yeah, the prosecution presented a really, I would say, straight and narrow case. Like they did not, even something like Blaze's texts,
Mm,
they were just like, kids send texts. That's nothing, like it's just a thing that people do. Don't don't pay attention to that. Like let's
right.
pay attention to the hard facts which we have, which are he joined a neo-Nazi group. He wrote down like murder isn't boring. He showed up with a mask and a knife
Mm,
to hang out with somebody and brought him to a park. And his story that he killed him over on this bench isn't possible because how would he have been able to kill someone over here, drag him all the way across the park, dig a hole, bury him, um, and then clean up the bench? He never would have been able to clean up the bench and dig a hole and cover it up all in an hour and a half. And we know that he left after an hour and a half.
right.
So like they were just like, don't be distracted by him being autistic or him being undiagnosed. Don't be distracted by the fact that he didn't have friends when he was in fifth grade. Like it doesn't. Maybe that's true. Maybe as the defense was trying to say, he had homosexual OCD, which is sort of a non-DSM sort of hypothesis that some people are extremely fixated on whether they're gay and are constantly trying to prove that they're not gay. It's just not relevant. And if he was gay himself, it's not relevant. You can still commit an anti-gay hate crime. So the defense was really just like, look at these like I kind of had a feeling that the jury deliberation was going to be short, mainly because of Woodward's testimony. But in the closing arguments, they showed for the first time this picture Woodward had posted or had taken. It was a selfie, like within a week or something when it happened. And it's like Woodward wearing the Atomwaffen mask and holding a pistol that was like his father's pistol. And it's just like, this is a very scary looking person who looks like he could kill somebody. And we know he killed somebody. So like um the first degree murder doesn't feel like a logical leap.
Mm,
It would feel more like a logical leap to say that it was somehow impulsive and spur of the moment and provoked by the idea that the victim took a picture and sent it to his friends, but we don't have any proof that the picture exists,
mm.
etc.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, I think, and again, just conscious of time, starting to wrap and think about going forward. One, I think, really interesting question from another researcher, Joshua Fisher Birch, really pertains to Woodward's legacy, right? You said, and I think we saw contemporaneously, right? After the murder takes place, he is celebrated, right, by Atomwaffen. He's used as part of their propaganda efforts, and we've obviously seen both from Atomwaffen, from that broader siege culture, and this kind of pantheon of far right saints, right, individuals who are willing to take that violent action that all the guys that you described, the guys on the couch, right, are looking up to. Um, what sense do you have of yeah, what Woodward's legacy will be here, if at the aftermath of this trial?
I don't know. I think that's probably more of a question for researchers than for me, because I try not to hang out in those online spaces. Um, to me, the thing I always, I mean, this is just more of a personal observation, but I mean, it just strikes me as such a waste and as such a, it just never should have happened. I mean, um, the two people should have never met up that night. Um, I look at Sam's story and I think it's a very American story. This is someone who grew up in a toxic household. Why was his house household toxic. His family was sort of hard right Catholic, but we also found out during the trial that his dad had been molested when he was a teenager, and that's why that was one of the reasons, or one of the things that informed his anti-gay views. So that we have sort of a multi-generational story of horror here, and how that came to bear on this kid. We have the story of appearances, a family not wanting to get their son diagnosed. His mom has a degree in psychology and should have been able to observe as early as kindergarten his symptoms. We found out he didn't like wearing t-shirts because of the way that the shirts felt, but she didn't get him diagnosed, maybe because of concerns of how the family would look if people knew that an autistic child, and how his life could have been different if he had been diagnosed and treated from a younger age and learned how to cope with his autism. We look at the issues with loneliness and the ways that far right extremists, sort of hyper masculine, so to speak, spaces online, misogynistic spaces online, appeal to people like that, um, and the way they can poison someone who's vulnerable on some level and capable on some level of doing something like this. Um, that caused why did Sam want to impress those people? You know, because of all sort of a cascading failures in his own upbringing and randomness. You know, um, dating apps, like the fact that they connected on Tinder, the ability to connect people with high school classmates, um, in a dating context that could turn out to be something completely dangerous. And it's just, I mean, the thing strikes me as incredibly tragic and horrible, and it just never should have happened. And I think that the legacy, that's sort of how I see the legacy. It's just a legacy of failure and in all these sort of typical and ordinary American ways.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, that's, look, I mean, again, conscious of time, I think that's really the place to leave it, right? I think it's 6 years after the murder. I think, there's finally hopefully a sense of closure for Blaze Bernstein's family. Obviously, I think this is something from your reporting that will continue to, leave a pretty significant scar in the lives of a lot of these people who were impacted in both of these families. So, I'll just, thank you again for taking the time. Thank you for your reporting. I invite all of you to please join me in thanking Louis for this incredible reporting. I think you know can't say enough about how significant it is to have journalists who actually go and cover this in the flesh, go to the courtrooms, do these interviews, see the people, make it more than just a document on a screen. So Louis, thank you again for taking the time. Thank you all of you for joining us today. On behalf of the program on extremism, we're very much looking forward to having you at our future events coming soon. And yeah, thank you again, and hope you all have a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you for the conversation.